My name is Matthew Zapruder, and I'm a poet and an associate professor at St. Mary's College in the San Francisco Bay Area. I want to welcome everybody. It's good to know that you're out there, however many you are and wherever you are. Thanks for being with us. Today's program kicks off a special series of programs created through a partnership between the Townsend Center for the Humanities at UC Berkeley and the Commonwealth Club. The focus of the series is catastrophe and the essential role that stories and storytelling play in helping us face and survive catastrophes. The goal is to share knowledge and renew hope by discussing literary accounts of catastrophic change throughout history. Interestingly, this program series was in development before the coronavirus crisis began, and we had many thoughts about what constituted our current state of catastrophe, which have all radically altered. So we'll have lots to talk about, unfortunately. And so I'm speaking to you from the San Francisco Bay Area, which was one of the first regions in the country to go into lockdown. Most of us have been inside for several weeks on pretty severe social distancing. And this new series of programs seeks to remind us that this is not the first time that human societies have faced catastrophic collapse. And today's program focuses on the book of Exodus. And it seems like a great time to look and listen to this story about the collapse of Pharaoh's empire and the rise of Israel and the introduction of the character of Moses. And it's a great time to do that. It stays before the Jewish holiday of Passover, which is the focus of which is based on this story. And joining me today for this conversation, I'm really honored and pleased to have Professor Ronald Hendel. He's the Norma and Sam Dabby Professor of Hebrew Bible and Jewish Studies at UC Berkeley. He's the author of many books and articles on the religion, literature, and history of the Hebrew Bible. He's so knowledgeable and thoughtful, and I'm just so pleased to be in conversation with him. Mostly it's going to be me asking him questions. And last thing before I jump in, I just want to remind people that you can ask questions. We'd love it if you'd ask questions. Please post those questions in the YouTube chat area, and they will be forwarded to me and Ron. Okay, so those are my introductory responsibilities discharged. Welcome again, everyone. And hey, Ron, how you doing?
Hey, Matthew. Good. How you doing?
Good. We were just talking about the fact that the last time we saw each other was in a bar in Oakland.
That was way more fun than this.
Was that like 1,000 years ago or something?
That was like 1,000 years ago. Now I'm hunched over in my office at home with a blanket in front of me, looking at my son's iPhone. This is really weird.
If that isn't the contemporary condition, I don't know what is, Ron.
Well, this is a funny place to talk about catastrophe and storytelling. Mm-hmm. It seems that we're in a state of catastrophe, so we should tell some stories. And this week, it seems like the Exodus is a good story to tell.
Yeah, I was familiar, of course, with Exodus in that sort of schoolboy way or school child way. I have a particular connection with it because my as I mentioned to you when we met up in person, my bar mitzvah Torah portion was Exodus chapter 4, when Moses protests that he is not the right person to deliver the message to the Pharaoh, and various miracles are made to be performed. And maybe we'll get into that. But I can't say that I was, that I remembered much of it. So I reread it before our meeting, and then I've been rereading it again this week during this kind of awful time that we're in, and it is indeed pertinent. What jumps out at you initially when we talk about the pertinence of this story?
Yeah, well, it seems to me that when there's a plague circulating outside, it's not that much of a stretch to see the story of the plagues in the Exodus as being relevant. And for the general topic that we're talking about, the relationship between catastrophe and storytelling, I think one of the things I'd like to emphasize, and I know you like this as well, is that one of the things that people do in the face of catastrophe is, at least ultimately, they turn that catastrophe into a story. They tell stories about the catastrophe. They make catastrophe, which can seem like such a random thing, by placing it into a story, it somehow makes sense of the catastrophe, and in so doing, it makes sense of life in the light of catastrophe. So that's one of the things that I would emphasize. The story of Exodus does. The catastrophe is this memory of 400 years of Egyptian bondage, of being slaves to Pharaoh. And this story tells about the catastrophe and about the miraculous survival and the miraculous defeat of the enemy, and the turning of catastrophe into a new opening to create a new people, a new era of history, a new sense of purpose and identity. So ideally, I would say that's what people tend to do with catastrophe, or at least after the catastrophe is over, to retrospectively make sense of it. Hopefully that's something that we'll be able to do in the near future.
Yeah. Well, a few things that you say immediately, there's a few things about what you say that immediately jump out at me. One is, one of the most important examples of this use of the book of Exodus in particular as a solace or an explanation for tragedy has to do with the African-American experience of slavery. The use of that story in various ways to make sense of something that cannot be made sense of, I don't think.
Yes, well, I totally agree. And this is something that I think shows you the power of storytelling in the face of catastrophe. So the African-American slave, the songs that they would sing, Go Down Moses, there was a kind of, it made a story that had a coherent ending. That is to say, Pharaoh is defeated, slavery ends, people are released from bondage into freedom. So even in the midst of the catastrophe, they could see the end of the story by placing that frame of the Exodus story over their own sufferings. So stories give hope. It gives you an orientation towards the future. It gives you a sense of solidarity with other people who are experiencing that catastrophe. In the case of African-American slaves, it also provided them with a common language to communicate their critique of slavery, their condemnation of slavery, and their hope for redemption in a language that the slave masters could not object to, because it was the Bible. So there's a way in which the story expresses a kind of hidden critique of their own oppressors that the oppressors couldn't really object to. So it was a very effective kind of story to tell at that time, because they'd say, well, we're just reading the Bible, praising the Lord.
One thing that jumped out at me in this reading, which is in the long series of instructions that the Lord gives to Moses to give to the people and throughout the book, in chapter 21 verse 16, there's an express prohibition of slavery, which is interesting given the religiosity of the slave owners. One wonders how they reconcile that particular verse with their behavior.
Good question. You're studying well, young Padawan learner.
My fifth reading of the Exodus. I'm finally interesting.
No, one of the very interesting things, and this is in the ancient world where slavery was an institution that people didn't question, but because of this memory of having been slaves to Pharaoh and in achieving redemption from slavery, there's a strong ethical component where slave laws are much more liberalized. They're not eliminated altogether, but they're very much liberalized. And secondly, there's a sense of compassion for the foreigner. This is also, I think, something that is worth emphasizing in terms of our contemporary situation. That the recollection is that Israel, the people of Israel, were strangers in a strange land. They were resident aliens in Egypt when they first went down at the end of Genesis, when they go down to Egypt. And then the Pharaoh enslaved them. But there's a strong sense in which the resident alien in Israelite society is subjected to the rights and responsibilities that regular citizens get.
Mm-hmm.
So there's a respect for the foreigner and a respect for the resident alien. They're even subject to the laws of the Sabbath, that they're not supposed to work on the Sabbath. They get a vacation as well.
Mm-hmm.
So this is something that I think is a very strong part of what I would call Exodus ethics. And that is that you treat the foreigner with respect, and they are part of your community. They're not an other, they're not an enemy, they're not an outside stain, but they are people that you support because you were yourself a stranger, a foreigner in a strange land.
Mm-hmm. Just an aside, but I have this experience whenever I reread the Bible of coming across all these phrases that were have lived in my brain for a long time, and I either didn't know or had forgotten that they were from the Bible. And of course, "Stranger in a Strange Land" is the title of a Robert Heinlein book. I was a science fiction nerd. I know you're going to find this hard to believe, Ron, but I was kind of a science fiction nerd when I was a kid, and I was a big Robert Heinlein fan, and I remember reading that book. And of course, reread, I was like, oh, right, that's where that's from.
Yeah, Moses said it before Robert Heinlein.
I want to slightly complicate our thinking about storytelling and historical memory. I know that's an area of scholarly interest for you, and maybe try to link it a little bit to our current situation. It is true that stories help us make sense of what's happened and can comfort us for better and for worse. In Exodus, one of the many odd things about Exodus is that the entire story of the liberation of the Jews is stage managed by Yahweh. It is said, I don't know how many times, you would know the exact number, that the Lord hardened Pharaoh's heart over and over. And so Moses goes, he says, X thing is going to happen if you don't let my people go. Then the Lord hardens the Pharaoh's heart. Pharaoh says no, and X thing happens. Y thing happens. Z thing happens. And down to the most horrible thing of all happening, which is the killing of the firstborn sons. And we discussed this when we met in person, but this idea that the story is being constructed by Yahweh for a future purpose. And it's disconcerting and even disturbing to think about that through the lens of human suffering, that the Egyptian people experience for the sake of a story that is going to be needed by God or by Moses or by the Israelites. And I wonder if you have thoughts about that. And one of the reasons, on this most recent rereading is I was just thinking about, of course, how important stories are in our current environment. I mean, people are always telling stories, and those stories have a means to an end. And it's curious to think about how actively people are manufacturing certain stories in order to achieve some purpose, for better and for worse. So that's one thing I wanted to dig into, because I think that does make more complicated our understanding of the role of storytelling in nation formation and identity, and how that might connect with our current situation.
Good. That's a terrific question, and I could go on for this all day long, so cut me off when I'm getting redundant. But there's two ways that I would kind of sculpt an approach to that question. One is the way this works within the Exodus story itself, and the other is that the way this works in the context of ancient Israelite history. Okay, so stories aren't necessarily the same as history, as what really happened. In fact, they never are. Just by the fact of placing something in a story frame with a beginning and a middle and an end and a complication and a resolution, you are sculpting the shape of time and causality and shaping the protagonists and antagonists. So stories are always fictive, at least in their general structure. I mean, life doesn't, events don't really have a fixed beginning, middle, and end, but stories do. So there's always a construct going on. Now, in the actual history, most of the things that we read about in the Exodus story probably didn't happen. Okay, so when you're worried that the Egyptians are suffering all of these plagues and so forth, well, some of these things didn't really happen. I'm reminded of one of my favorite Gershwin songs, the things that you're liable to read in the Bible, it ain't necessarily so. Mm-hmm. Okay, so we don't really have to worry about what the Egyptians' response was to the death of the firstborn son, because these are story motifs. They didn't necessarily happen. So we can worry about fictive characters, but we don't have to worry about the real Egyptians. What seems to be the actual historical backdrop is that in ancient Canaan, in the period before Israel emerged as a nation, okay, and this is the way the story is being told. This is the ancestral story before Israel emerged as a nation in the land of Canaan, in the Promised Land. In this pre-Israelite period, for roughly 400 years, the land of Canaan was part of the Egyptian Empire. Now, what this means is that all of the people of Canaan were, according to the imperial ideology, slaves of Pharaoh. Okay, so they were subjected to all sorts of harsh taxation and conscription and forced labor and things like that in the land of Canaan. Mm-hmm. There were also, during the Egyptian Empire, many Canaanites were taken to be slaves in Egypt by military campaigns, by pharaohs, sometimes by taxes. People would be taxed by saying, send us X number of people each year. And also because of famines, people would sell their children into slavery, or people would go into debt and go into slavery. And all of these people were sucked into Egypt, which was the big imperial center of the time. So there were many, many thousands of Canaanites who had been taken into Egypt as slaves. Now, what happens after roughly 400 years is the Egyptian empire collapses. Okay, and one of the consequences of that collapse is the previous economic structure and political structures in Canaan collapsed, and you have the birth of these new societies, including the people of Israel. So this formation of the people of Israel is a direct consequence of the collapse of the Egyptian empire in Canaan. Probably some of the Canaanites who had been slaves in the land of Egypt also escaped because the border fortresses were no longer manned. So people could escape back to their homeland. And so you have a combination of a native people in Canaan joining this land, this people of Israel, who had been enslaved by Pharaoh for generations, even the ones who had never left Canaan. They were politically and legally slaves of Pharaoh. Plus, they're joined by some escaped slaves from Egypt. So somehow in the crystallization of this new people, this memory, and I think this is a genuine historical memory of having been slaves to Egypt, having been under the heavy hand of Egyptian bondage, was a kind of unifying memory that created a sense of self, a sense of collective identity, and a sense that their community arose out of the defeat of Pharaoh and the defeat of Egypt, which naturally they would attribute to their god, Yahweh. So historically, this memory of slavery is a kind of bonding agent for the people. And the story of the defeat of Pharaoh by Yahweh is part of the story-making creativity that went along with this new identity and this new people. So the story itself, interestingly enough, presents itself as a collective memory, as a cultural memory, because it's said over and over again, you shall tell your children about this story.
Right. Well, I grew up, and I mean, and maybe you did too. I mean, I grew up, every year getting the message that this is a story that our people had to remember, the Jewish people
Yes.
have to remember, and this is what gives us kind of unity or sense of historical memory, regardless of where we are and what's happened. And I mean, it does kind of, again, maybe I'm in this sort of mood right now, but it is a little bit disturbing that nation formation or identity formation is so closely connected with, let's say, opposition. That there's no, that's very hard to imagine people. I don't know. For some reason, I keep thinking of well, not for some reason. I mean, I keep thinking about the conflict between the need for, let's say, collective action that we currently are experiencing and have been for a long time. If you want to think about climate change or something smaller but extremely important, like the need for healthcare in this country, think about that in opposition to these forces or these groups that immediately coalesce around a sense of oppression and a need to identify themselves against this other force. I mean, I think that the people who oppose, collective sorts of action that we need in America often think of themselves as like the Israelites in the land of Egypt. I mean, probably literally even, as being, under the thumb of an oppressive force and having to unify and persevere, and any form of resistance is acceptable because, you're being harmed. And so I know when I was reading Exodus this time, I guess I had this uncomfortable feeling that there was somehow the story formation of it was linked to some, troubling.
Well, I think you're absolutely right. And this is the dark side of the Exodus. The dark side is that it is an oppositional story. I mean, in a sense, every story has to be an oppositional story. You have to have good guys and bad guys. But because you have to have those, it creates a kind of dark distinction between us and them.
Mm-hmm.
Okay, and so this is the dark side. This is the painting of the enemy, whether the enemy is Egypt in the story of the plagues, or whether the enemy is the Canaanites when they have escaped from Egypt and they're conquering the Promised Land.
Or the Amalekites, or the
Amalekites.
One of the people in, what most disturbingly, even the people in, after the Golden Calf incident, the Israelites themselves were purged.
Yes, so there's good guys and bad guys within the community. So there's all sorts of violence in the story.
I don't mean to be negative about it. I just this maybe it's tough in this current environment. I'm looking for, for a different model of a different story, I guess. And there's a lot about this story that is very moving. It is about courage and perseverance, and I mean, the figure that I find, I mean, Moses is just such an complex and fascinating figure. And I was thinking too, and I wanted to ask you about this, about to what extent you think our view of a leader is influenced by Moses in the Exodus story. When I was reading this Exodus this time through, I was thinking, he sounds a lot like Lincoln. But then I was thinking, well, my idea of Lincoln is probably filtered through this story. I mean, what do I really know about Lincoln? Only what I've read, of course, and what I've heard. So what the way his story, of a flawed leader whose courage is, waxes and wanes, but is ultimately has a good heart and kind of finds his way through, but a tragic figure who can't make it to the front, all that stuff. I mean, that kind of idea of a hero is so embedded in our cultural consciousness, I think.
Yeah, no, you're absolutely right. And Moses is a real archetypal hero. It would be hard to find a major hero in Western civilization that isn't influenced by Moses in one way or another. But certainly Abraham Lincoln, I mean, he was, the father of the country. He was Father Abraham. He had a tragic death at the end, like Moses has a tragic death. He was filled with self-doubts at certain points, just as Moses is filled with self-doubts.
Mm-hmm.
There's a sense in which, at certain points, when the Israelites have this stiffness of neck and want to go back to Egypt because it's so hard to be wandering in the desert and so forth, Moses forces them to continue on this journey. In a sense, he forces them to be free against their own will.
Mm-hmm.
And there's a sense that Abraham Lincoln, in our national story, did the same sort of thing. He forced people to be free, even if they were resistant or pulling against him. So these are heroic qualities that, where you can't really tell the difference between the biblical story and our national story.
Well, and
which again goes to how these stories function.
And there's such a incredibly perceptive human truth about that, which is that if you want to achieve anything that's difficult, you are going to have to, people are going to have resistance to it, even, and maybe especially your own people. There's no way that the only way you can be a pleaser like Aaron and cave instantly and build a golden calf, that's one way to handle conflict. But if you're a person of, who has a larger goal in mind, you're going to have to be, take a lot of abuse. And it's really, I can't, as I was reading this time, I was just thinking so much about leadership. I really think Exodus is a story about different types of leadership, and for better and for worse. And Moses is, certainly far from a perfect leader. There's no doubt about it, but he's got a lot of courage, I think, especially for someone who isn't, maybe he's gifted in certain ways, but he's not rhetorically gifted. He's not a person who's gifted in that way.
But even his self-doubts, I think, make him a more human, a more complicated leader. He's not just a cartoon
character. I mean, what a contemporary individual in a way. We've got a couple of questions. Ron, did you have something you want to comment on about that, or
I was just going to say that the need for leadership in a time of crisis is also something that has weird resonances with our situation today. You want someone like a Lincoln or a Moses who has self-doubts, who has a complicated personality, who can be courageous in the face of opposition. And it seems to me that in our world today, we're lacking that a lot.
Yet we're attracted to exactly the opposite, of course, because we're scared. And that's a legitimate thing, or not scared. Or maybe we've sent. Let's just say, in a more neutral way, so many of us have a deep sense in ourselves that change is necessary. So someone with conviction and someone with leadership skills, is very attractive. And I don't know. I couldn't help but think of Obama on some level when I was reading Moses. But maybe I'll read.
Well, let me just add.
Go ahead. Yeah.
In the way that the Exodus story affects our national story, when Obama first became president, people were comparing him to Joshua. That if Martin Luther King was our Moses, he was the Joshua. He was the successor. This was language again of the African American church that resonated a lot with what he was doing, putting into place the sorts of dreams that the martyred Moses, who never made it into the promised land, was dreaming of.
Far be it from me to I say this with all humility, but Obama strikes me as more of a Moses figure in the sense of the way he took abuse from all sides for trying to lead people into larger goals. Although, so we've got a couple of questions.
Okay.
Poetic language, which I'm gonna put on hold for a second because I'm not even sure how to answer that, but maybe I'll ask in a minute. But this one I think is one, Ron, that I'm sure you would have a lot to say about. Here's the question. The mythic function of the story contrasts with dominant Western narratives. For example, Dream, Manifest Destiny. Please talk about the Exodus myth as a challenge to contemporary stories, particularly with regard to catastrophe and crisis.
Well, I'm not sure that. I mean, there's certainly ways that it contrasts, but it also informs. I mean, ideas of the American dream, when the Puritans first came to settle in this country, they saw themselves as being on a biblical mission to create a new promised land in this new world, and they saw themselves as a new Israel. So there's a lot of ways in which many aspects of the American dream, and even the negative aspects, the othering of the Native Americans and stealing the land from them as if they were the Canaanites in the story, or the Amalekites or something. There's many ways in which for both good and evil, the biblical story of the Exodus and conquest, when you add that on, informs the American story of manifest destiny, all these sorts of things. So there's a sense in which I would say to critique the American story is also to critique the biblical story. And one of the nice things about the biblical story is that it's complicated enough so that you can see elements of critique already there, such as the love of the stranger.
Well, I feel like one of the main elements of critique that's in there is, so much of Yahweh's, let's say, he doesn't attempt in any way to justify his commandments or his power through logic or through appeals to larger ethical ideas. He simply is, the cloud of smoke or the fire on the mountain or whatever. I mean, he's this very theatrical, scary, patriarchal person, and the rules themselves might be many of them might be laudable, but they're not. There's not, in my reading of Exodus, there isn't a lot of attempt to justify them. Moses, on the other hand, and I might be wrong about that, but Moses, on the other hand, appeals to God on the basis of logic and on the basis of ethical considerations. Like he's a person who argues with God and says, well, this is going to make you look bad, or if you do it this way, or if you said you were going to do this, and then if you do that, is that really fair? And blah blah blah. And look at them; they've been wandering in the desert. They've had a tough time, So I mean, there's a kind of human, complicated human aspect to Moses again. That's very that feels like there's an inner conflict in the story itself between those two ways of looking at the world, or those ways of like kind of trying to justify behavior, I guess.
Well, I think that the conflict between Yahweh and Moses is very profound, as you're pointing out, that Moses argues with God about what's the right thing to do in this circumstance, what's the just thing to do, what's the ethical thing to do. And sometimes he convinces Yahweh to shape up and to not do what Yahweh was going to do.
Off and calm down at least.
Or at least calm down, take a chill pill.
Have a timeout.
Have a timeout. But Moses is so focused on what the right thing is that he's able to prevail over God in these moments. That Moses is kind of the rock that even God relies on, which is quite remarkable.
As an aside, another thing that's contemporary about the story is that Moses shows character development. I mean, he goes from this person who's so timid that he can't even imagine. Well, can't even imagine. I mean, it's a tough job to go in front of Pharaoh and say, "Let my people go." But he doesn't. He's afraid to confront Pharaoh, understandably, to a person who's willing to confront God. I mean, that's a pretty big character development there. And
absolutely.
And it feels justified when you read the story. You're like, it's believable that he would have made this transition because he's been through all this stuff,
Well, there's something I want to ask you about that we talked about a little bit last time. At the end of Moses's life, where's this great tragic moment that he led the people to the verge of the promised land, but he doesn't get to go there himself. And you described this, you talk about this very nicely in your book that I want to promote here, called Why Poetry. You talk about negative capability. I want you to explain to the audience what you mean by that in that moment at the end of Moses' life.
Yeah, well, that of course occurs in Deuteronomy, as you all know. That's right. That's not in Exodus, but we can leave Exodus for a minute.
Well, it's still Moses.
It's still Moses story. Yeah, well, negative capability is a concept that the poet John Keats formulated in a letter to his brothers, and basically he was thinking about Shakespeare, and he was trying to come up with a kind of idea about what makes the poetical character, what makes what's at the heart of poetry and poets and the poetic consciousness. And he talks about the ability to be in contradiction, without an irritable reaching after fact or reason. And his point is that contradiction and conflict and the multiple existences, simultaneous existence of conflicting ideas is inherent to what makes a poem a poem. And to be in that space and be able to clearly perceive that contradiction, which is at the heart of existence, is at the heart of poetry, and that Shakespeare had that ability to be in that place in his plays and in his poems. And I think about that moment of Moses, standing there, literally kind of at the edge and not making it, and almost also sort of disappearing, melting away, right? And he doesn't, because there isn't really a lot of specific details about his death, and are there? So it's that, to me, seems like such a profound moment of negative capability of seeing the promised land. You should deserve to go there, and it's right there for you, and it can't be achieved. And that the feeling that I get and when I contemplate that moment is one of negative capability. Like that it's somehow feels very wrong, but also somehow perfect that he wouldn't be able to get there.
Mm-hmm. Good. And I think this responds to the viewer's question about the poetry in the story. I think there's some very powerful moments of literary resonance throughout the story. We've been talking about the personality and character of Moses, but I think that moment at the very end is just an amazing point for the end of Moses. It's also the end of the Pentateuch.
Yeah, right.
And it's this moment of tremendous expectation, but there's a kind of tragic quality to it as well, which is really remarkable.
Yeah, and the end is the beginning in a way. That's that too.
Yeah.
It's like this whole thing is just the beginning of a story, and here we are. And that does kind of, in my more optimistic moments, I do think about this current catastrophe, and then the catastrophe of climate change, and the catastrophe of our political system as being something that we must work through together as a people to get to the next thing. It couldn't have been any other way. I think this particular situation we're in definitely could have been another way had we had a competent person running things and people who were paying attention. But in the larger sense, the crisis that we're in is one that we have to go through as a country. And it's a terrible thought, and I don't wish anything on anybody, but I feel like I do, at my more optimistic moments, think and hope that this is something we can work through.
Well, in a sense, when everything is stripped away and you see things, as they truly are, there's a way in which it can be, not just a catastrophe, but it's also, as you say, the potential for a new beginning and of a new perception of the way that beginning could go. Am I using this right? That this could be a moment of negative capability for all of us?
Well, I don't know. We'll see. It's I think in order to move forward, we probably need to have negative capability. We probably need to be able to keep in mind something about the terrible unacceptability of certain types of behaviors and of people who hold them, along with the simultaneous idea that they are our brothers and sisters, and that we need to somehow find a way to be together on this, because otherwise we'll just be paralyzed in constant conflict.
Well, again, to be optimistic, there's a sense, there's a very tangible sense that we clearly are all in this together.
That's starting to be, it's interesting how quickly the rhetoric has changed. I was just reading today, I don't know why I saw this, but the head of J.P. Morgan Chase. I guess his last name is Diamond, which seems a little on the line to me, frankly. But be that Dimond, but still, it's a little too exact. Had suddenly started to sound like Trotsky. That we're all in this together and we need to pull through and we need to find a way to get together and he practically was drifting into from each according to his needs and from each according to his ability to each according to his
Good.
needs.
Good.
I don't buy it, but the rhetoric has very quickly changed, obviously.
Yeah, and not only within this country but across the world.
Yeah.
So there can be good things that could come out of this kind of catastrophe.
Oh, I hope so. I want to go back a bit to the question from the viewer or listener, Zoomer, about the poetry of Exodus. And maybe I'll just read this. And I do think this is a question for both. It's addressed to me, but I think it's a question for both of us because I don't have the language. I don't know the original language of this text that it was written in. So would you be comfortable as a poet commenting on the language, the poetry of Exodus? Could you point us to certain places where you find the language is up to the task, where it can encompass catastrophe and tragedy, and perhaps places where it is overwhelmed, where a catastrophe slips away from the story and out of the poet's grasp? Ooh, that's a very poetical question, I think. Did anything jump to mind?
Well, in terms of the literary style, most of the Exodus story is prose, but it's a very poetic kind of prose. It's a very terse literary style, and one of the ways that the writers create different kinds of poetic effects, semantic effects, dramatic effects, is by the repetition of certain words. And there are certain words that are repeated in slightly different ways in certain sequences, which creates a kind of underlying poetic repetition within the prose. So there are, the repetition of the heaviness of Pharaoh's heart, the repetition of Moses as one who saves people. He saves people at various points. For example, when Moses flees to the land of Midian, he comes across a well with these Midianite daughters of the local priest congregating around the well, and they're being oppressed by shepherds, and Moses saves them. It says, who is this savior who came to get us, blah, blah, blah. And he saved us against the Egyptians. So there are subtle little links there just by the repetition of words, verbs, personages, relationships that create a kind of artistic undertone within the story that's very effective and also very subtle.
That's amazing. Yeah, that's great.
Yeah. The other thing is that there are some poems in the Exodus story. In Exodus 15, right when the people are crossing the Red Sea, there's this beautiful poem that's called the Song of the Sea. And this occurs at a moment of real crescendo. And it says that Miriam and the other women of Israel went out and danced and played tambourines and sang this song. It's a song of victory. And it's a very beautiful poetic song which presents in a kind of impressionistic way the crossing of the Red Sea and Yahweh's defeat of the Egyptians. It doesn't do it in sequential order, but does it in bursts of different scenes that is really quite beautiful and quite dramatic, and uses some images that harken back to older stories of where warrior gods defeated sea monsters, which in this kind of multi-layered sense of the poetry casts Pharaoh and in the Egyptian army as a kind of sea monster that Yahweh defeats and destroys, after which, in the traditional story, God creates the world. So there's a very cosmogonic sense where Yahweh's defeat of Pharaoh at Pharaoh's army at the sea is a kind of repetition, symbolic repetition of the creation of the world at the beginning out of the primeval waters and in opposition to primeval watery monsters.
Well,
So these are all things that are going on in the poetry.
That idea of poet, anaphora, repeated structures is at the heart of poetry.
Mm-hmm.
It's I often like only sort of half jokingly tell my students that if you want to know the secret, I'll tell you the secret of poetry. It's just keep repeating the same structure over and over again until it starts to sound mythic.
Oh, good, perfect.
and some other secrets too, having to do with negations and questions. But repetition is at the heart of it, and we see it all over. And so both anaphora, like strict anaphora, like actually repeating syntax, but then also, like you're saying, these sort of symbolic repetitions, micro versions of things that later become larger stories and echoes or whatever. That is definitely a big feeling in this book. Are you familiar with Whitman's short piece, "The Bible is Poetry"?
Oh no, I'm not.
It's remarkable. It's a remarkable piece of writing. It's in November Boughs, which was kind of one of his later collections of prose, and it's a really interesting piece of writing because it's a lot of it's about trying to talk about the poetry of the Bible, what makes it feel poetic to people, and also how important it is to nation formation.
Oh, I got to read that.
Yeah, he says that about it that basically that it's so bound up in our American life that it's more than any one thing else. This is a quote: more than any one thing else, it has been the axis of civilization and history throughout thousands of years, and except for which this America of ours, with its polity and essentials, could not now be existing. So he's making an argument that there's something about the very consciousness of the Old Testament, the Bible, that is, that's inherent to our political life. And there's a lot of sort of explanations of that in the essay, but it's a I don't know, made me think. I was sort of paging through this. I have this the Whitman, the Library of Whitman, and I was sort of looking through, and I noticed that title, and I thought, this is maybe pertinent to our discussion, and I was just reading it the other day.
That's great. Well, one of the wonderful things about Whitman is that he kind of exemplifies how the Bible becomes an American kind of tale in his prosodic style.
Mm-hmm.
In this blank verse, is that what you call it?
Yeah, well, it's not even blank verse, because it's blank verse, strictly speaking, would be have a metrical component.
Oh.
He's free verse. I mean, Whitman really wrote the first free verse. I mean, his 1855. I mean, free verse had been written in other languages, like a prose poems or whatever that is in French, but in Whitman's 1855 appearance of Leaves of Grass was brought free verse suddenly and kind of radically to the not just American literature but world literature, and it never looked.
So where he got the idea? One of my graduate students taught this to me. The King James Bible, the prose is written verse by verse, and you can read it as a kind of prose poetry.
Well, you really hear that echo for sure. And the question about the poetry of it, I mean, reading the King James Bible is so, you just realize how much rhetoric, how much style is absorbed from that. And that goes for a lot of poetry too. Kind of like you had said earlier, this terseness and a kind of like directness of style that feels very weirdly American. Actually,
I think it feels very American. Whitman made it American.
Right. It's a super anachronistic and weird thing to say, to call it American, the King James Bible, but because of Whitman and others, it is for sure. And of course, the other pillar of American literature, Dickinson, was a deep scholar and deeply knowledgeable about the Bible too. So that's, and although she was Episcopalian, so the Common Book of Prayer would have been more her wheelhouse. as it were.
She has a beautiful poem about Moses, about how sad. In fact, back on our negative capability, she has a beautiful poem about how sad it is that Moses didn't get to go into the promised land.
It is sad.
So she makes beautiful poetic, American poetic verse out of a number of biblical stories.
Well, we got another question, which is definitely out of my league, but probably almost assuredly not out of yours, which is, have you read the story of Moses in the Quran? And if so, can you comment on it and its differences? I have not read that story, but
in the Quran, Moses is Musa. I'm not sure that I know of places where it differs from the biblical story. I think most of the stories about Musa map pretty straightforwardly onto the biblical story. But Muhammad knew the Bible. There were a lot of Jews in Mecca and in Saudi Arabia at the time. So he knew the Bible very well. So there's all sorts of snippets of parts of the story of Musa, of Adam, of Joseph, of a lot of other biblical characters. But I don't know that there's something that is in some ways askance of the biblical story of Musa.
Yeah.
But he's one of the great prophets, and so he's placed in the series of, from Musa to Isa, which is Jesus, to Muhammad.
I want to come back a little bit to our contemporary moment, and maybe some more questions will come in. But I want to come back and just maybe open up a little bit whether or not this text has much to help us with in our current situation, whether it has to do with how we understand leadership, or how we understand unity, or how we understand commitment or suffering. I'm sure it has many things to offer. I think about this line from Rilke. I only know it in translation. There is one winter so endlessly winter that only by wintering through it can our hearts survive. And I think about that a lot in our current situation. We're somehow only by wintering through this winter, somehow only by suffering through this suffering will we survive. And I think about that with the, almost casual way that lengths of time are mentioned in Exodus, 40 years here and 40 days there. And, and is there something to be learned or taken away from the way that, for better and for worse, these people dealt with this unprecedented situation where they did not know when the end would be? We know that there was an end, but they were wandering around not knowing anything. That's
true. If you're wandering in the desert for 40 years, that's a long time.
That's a long time. And they didn't know that they were told that there was going to be an end in the same way they were told there's going to be an end to this, but sure, we can be told, but that doesn't necessarily mean,
Yeah. Well, this is where Exodus is a story of how hard it is in some ways to, survive disaster, to make your way back to normalcy. Mm-hmm. It's not an easy thing to do, and that it's hard, and people want to just give up. In the story, the Israelites are all saying, "Oh, why are you making us do this? Let's go back and be slaves in Egypt. At least there we get to have our leeks and our garlic." Now, I can't even find garlic at the store anymore.
Yeah, they're the original kvetchers. Those.
They're exactly. There's a whole series of stories that I call the stories of kvetching.
Yeah, they're kvetching.
This is where Moses kind of pushes them through. He's sort of like, I'm not sure this is a good analogy, but he's sort of like Tony Fauci, telling us you have to separate, you have to stay home. It's good for, even if you don't want to, even if you want to go out and do stuff, you have to do this for the greater good.
What an inverse, right? Don't wander the desert. Don't go from your homes. Don't get all together and go out
But
across.
we want to go back and have the kind of life that we had in Egypt, where at least you could get good meals and garlic and stew and the flesh pots of Egypt.
Sure, the world is getting hotter by the moment, and sure there's massive income inequality and systematic racism, but at least we could go to the movies.
Exactly.
So yeah.
So you need someone to. So when you're kvetching, you need someone to kvetch back at you and tell you to behave. I mean, that's one of the small lessons.
And also there was a sense that the whole, like, again, I come back to the fact that the whole situation was forced in a way, by God and by Moses. I mean, they didn't have to, I mean, the situation was becoming gradually more intolerable, but it was sort of the frog in the boiling water story, that this could have gone on presumably for a longer time. The Israelites could have stayed in Egypt and been slaves, and it would have sucked, but at least they wouldn't have been wandering around the desert. But there was forced to a crisis in a way, in the same way that we're being forced to it now by factors outside our control, right? And then what happens,
Yeah, well, it's not easy. Once you make it to the promised land, things are not so easy either.
So what's the equivalent of the golden calf in our current situation? I don't want to put you in a complicated place politically, but what what's the
when I mean, I'm just riffing here, but when people say there's an easy cure, an easy solution,
right.
Don't stay the course, just do whatever Trump has on his mind that day. That's a cop-out.
Or it's just the seasonal flu.
You're not gonna, it's just going to go away. We can ignore it. These are golden calves. These are false ideals.
I'm going to ask you,
lure you away from the hard path.
I want to ask you another dangerous question, and you can definitely take a pass on this if you want. But it strikes me as deeply ironic that some of the people who are most vocally presenting these golden calf type ideas are figures of religious Christian religious leaders. Not all of them, of course. There are many, vast majority of Christian religious leaders are saying stay home and wash your hands. But some of the most vocal people and you would think that they would maybe make a connection, but maybe they're making a different connection. I don't know.
Well, as you remarked earlier, these are the Aarons of the story, the people who can't stay the course and who immediately swerve and take the easy path and give the people what they think the people want. But they're hucksters, they're fakes, and ultimately they're shown up for it as Aaron is.
Mm-hmm.
So Jerry Falwell Jr., all of these people, they're just fake hucksters who are selling golden calves to people.
I mean, this time reading the story was so interesting because I thought about how subtle it is that, Moses sort of more or less not forces God, but basically, keeps whining until God lets Aaron do the talking, and God doesn't want to do it. And it turns out that Aaron wasn't so great after all, like down the road. And it takes a while. It takes a while for that to come out. There's a narrative patience there where it's not like immediate that, and there's no gloating in the text either.
Well, I think you're legitimate
to come down and say, by the way, I told you that guy, you should have done it on your own,
But I think your point is a good one. There's character development for Moses. And so by that time of the story, he's not intimidated anymore. He has his own voice. He's able to criticize Aaron, and he's able to criticize God. So he's really the one that stays the course. So in a sense, he eclipses Aaron in that respect, which is part of his upward ascent of the solidification of his character and of his drive and his desire to see this thing through.
So I have I want to take advantage of your presence. We have a few more minutes left, and I want to just ask you about a few things that on rereading totally mystified me. Would you mind undergoing a quick round of stump the professor of biblical?
Are these yes or no questions?
No, they're just like what the hell is going on questions.
Okay.
The first question is, what is the deal with these magicians, Pharaoh's magicians? Like who? So Moses shows up and does his miracles, and then what? The magicians can also do them somehow. Like how? Like what is their deal? And what's
for the first
to that?
Well, this is also part of this kind of upward ascent of Moses and of the dramatic movement of the story. For the first, I think, 3 plagues, the Egyptians can do it too.
Yeah, right. That was a bit of a twist. I'd forgotten.
Yeah. This is part of the narrative quality of it. I mean, it's a great story, and it builds in various ways. And so at first, Pharaoh, he's not afraid of these people. He's not intimidated. Right. He's got people who can do magic too. And in Egypt, if you go to Cairo, you'll see people doing, flute dances, and the cobra comes up. And there are all sorts of magicians in the Near East, in the Middle East to this day. So Egypt was known for having this magical quality. There's also Egyptian inscriptions, the Book of the Dead, and so forth. So they had quality magicians. They could keep up for the first 3, but then they get blown away.
I know it wasn't supposed to be funny, probably, but I found it a little bit funny.
Oh, it is a little funny.
They kept up with him for a bit. They were like,
it's definitely funny when Moses takes out his staff and it turns into a snake. And the Egyptian magicians do exactly the same thing. And then Moses' snake eats their snake.
Right.
I think that's vaudeville.
High comedy.
It really is funny. So let me say, in the translations, it's a snake. The word that's used could also mean crocodile.
Oh.
Which makes it an even more impressive trick. And if his crocodile eats the other guy's crocodile, that's even a little more dramatic.
And we were talking about when we met together about in my Torah portion, the beginning of Exodus book 4, about how that's the section where Moses, after the burning bush, where Moses says they're not going to believe me, if Pharaoh's not going to believe me, and then put your hand in your and pull it out, and it's leprous, or throw your staff on the ground, it's a snake. And I always thought that was basically what that is it's metaphor, right? It's I will give you the gift of transforming one thing into another, or connecting 2 things, and that's a kind of poetical magic. That's basic poetical.
Oh, good. Oh, I like that. That's very good.
This is Ovid's metamorphosing, or Aristotle's notion that poets have an eye for resemblances. They can see things being alike that other people can't see, and then they make them alike, and then everybody can see it. That's basically what Moses is doing. He said, my staff is like a snake, and I will show you it's like that. And so that's deep poetical magic.
So he's able to actualize a metaphor.
Yeah, what I asked you in when we talked, it was, who's the poet there? Is it God, or is it Moses, or who's actually performing that miracle? I mean, it's to me, Moses seems like, I'll answer my own question to say that to me, Moses seems like the quintessential poet, the true poet who doubts his own power. That almost all poets I know are carrying around a great deal of doubt, both about their vocation, about its worth, about its usefulness, about its effectiveness. And Moses' dilemma, I am going to perform this miracle, or this set of miracles, and still they're not going to believe me. I'm going to make metaphor and they won't believe me. Felt to me so close to what so many poets fear and hope for, both in their own in their own work. And it's just the fact that it is really struck me as metaphor. What God and Moses together performing as metaphor was so.
That's very nice.
There's a deep kind of wisdom there, and I've never really been able to do anything with that observation other than share it with you now. But
well, let me add a couple nuances to it.
Please.
I think that's very perceptive, and I think that really is going on. And certainly Moses's self-doubt is a major theme of that chapter. But I would say that it's not only a doubt in terms of communication, in terms of making X into Y. It's also doubt that goes along with being any kind of leader.
Mm-hmm.
It goes along with being a prophet. Prophets are, people who tell people what's going to happen, and in Moses' case, he makes it happen. But being a prophet is a very difficult thing, and there's tremendous moments of doubt for many of the biblical prophets. He's also a legislator, so he's creating this nation. He's giving them the laws, but there's also doubt as to whether these are, wise laws and so
And as
forth.
an aside, he kind of invents not exactly representative democracy, but at least representative government. Sort of an aside. His what is it? His father-in-law tells him that it's too much work for him to do all this himself, so he better appoint some representatives to do it. And so
he appoints representatives.
Democracy, but it's
and here's another way that the biblical story kind of blends into the American story. In the early modern period, political theorists who were starting to argue for democracy as over against kingship as the right kind of government, they took the example of Moses going to the people and saying, "Do you accept the laws of Yahweh?" And so this goes back to something you said before. Yahweh doesn't just give the laws, but through Moses, he asks the people if they're willing to accept them. This is in Exodus chapter 19 and chapter 24. And the people says, yes, what Yahweh has commanded us, we will do. And people took that in the early modern period as a warrant for democracy.
Like literally a warrant, like
yes.
I give you this power of my own free will.
Literally a warrant, that the biblical covenant that they say, we agree to enter into this covenant. You will be our God. We will be your people, and we will follow your laws. This was transformed by people like Thomas Hobbes and John Locke into the idea of a social contract.
No, it's amazing. That's really cool.
Yeah. And they're quoting the biblical laws, and they're quoting those passages in Moses.
To circle back with a final observation, and then maybe we'll have one. I'd love to hear a final comment from you, but maybe one of the biggest lessons that everybody can learn from this story about, and really getting back into Moses as a figure, is that a great leader really does have doubt in his heart. And we should probably be quite suspicious of anyone from any side of the political spectrum who exudes certainty. It's critique that what I just said, because when one is in a desperate time, in a dire time, what we do need is someone with great certainty and great conviction. Mm-hmm. But the true example of negative capability would be to have that kind of certainty and conviction and also have doubt and humility. That would be a truly, truly great leader and a great individual. I don't know if we have a person like that in our lives right now. Maybe we do. We just don't know it, but or maybe we know it. I don't know. But we could use it. We could use a good Moses right around now, I think.
Well, let me say that really hits the essence of what Moses is. He's a great leader, but he's also racked with doubt, and he has this character development, and he has this tragic final moment where he doesn't actually achieve what he wanted to achieve, but the people achieve it on his behalf, and he dies. This is also taken up into the New Testament in the character and character development of Jesus. Mm-hmm. On the verge of his final appointment in the Garden of Gethsemane, he has doubt also.
Take this cup from me, Father.
Take this cup from me, Father. Yep. And so this is his Moses moment, or his moment of Mosaic doubt.
Yeah.
And going through that moment of doubt in this kind of dark night of the soul that he experiences at the Garden of Gethsemane is what enables him to be a more full hero, a full character, and a kind of salvific hero, just as Moses is in the moment of his death, just as Moses is again. So I would say, since this is the week not only of Passover but also of Easter,
right?
And because the Last Supper was Jesus's Seder,
mm-hmm.
tying these different leaders and heroes and ideals together, that to be a great figure is to have doubt and to go and to work through that instead of being completely confident that everything you say is by definition correct. This is very foreign to Moses and Jesus.
Yeah, it's not, unfortunately, not too foreign to our current leadership.
I know. That's the tragedy. That's the tragedy of our situation.
Yeah, well, I suppose that almost any political situation is going to have that conflict between people who are behaving that way and somebody else. I'm hoping that, yeah, like I said, I'm hoping there's another model, another figure, but it remains to be seen. Well, I think it's a good time to end.
Good.
I thank you so much, Ron. I want to I think we should all, in our private spaces, in our socially distanced private spaces, be very thankful to you for joining us and being here for this virtually for this Commonwealth Club program. And as I said earlier, this is the first in a series of programs between the Commonwealth Club and the Townsend Center for the Humanities. And the next program will be announced shortly. You can go to commonwealthclub.org to learn more. It's going to be a great series of speakers talking about things that really matter through the lens of storytelling, literature, and I'm very excited to be a viewer of them. And so, I want to thank you all again. My name is Matthew Zapruder, and I would say that this virtual program of the Commonwealth Club, the place where you are in the know, is now adjourned.
Thanks, Matthew.
Thanks, Ron.